So good morning and welcome. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. My name is Beth Swanson, and I am CEO of A Better Chicago. We are a nonprofit venture philanthropy here in Chicago, and what we do is we raise and pool capital to invest those funds into what we believe are highly effective, high-impact, youth-serving organizations across the city of Chicago. To date, we've raised and deployed over $73 million. And all of the organizations we support have reached over 115,000 young people. So we're thrilled to be doing that work in partnership with many of you and all the folks on our panel. Also, more importantly, we feel like we need to raise up issues that are critical to children in this city. Chronic absenteeism is one, and we are very glad to be having this illustrious panel with us to talk about that work today. I also want to thank the University of Chicago Education Lab for being a partner in this work and also this event, and they obviously work tirelessly on these issues, again, on behalf of the young people in Chicago. So before we jump into discussion, a few quick housekeeping notes. Thrilled to have all of you and want to hear from you, but also want to hear from everyone in the audience. There are cards, there should be cards at your seats. I can see them. My team, you can raise your hand, wave, okay, will be on site to help grab those cards and questions and get them up to us. We'll hold about 15 minutes at the end of the conversation for Q&A, so please do not be shy. And I want to welcome our panelists. And if you could each just introduce yourself briefly, that would be great. And I'll start with Monica to my left.
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Beth, and the Better Chicago team for having me today and my fellow panelists. We had a really nice discussion just before we walked in, and it's just so nice to be in person in a room full of people who are all wanting to learn more and hopefully roll up their sleeves and help. I'm Monica Bhatt. I'm the Senior Research Director at the University of Chicago Education Lab and have been fortunate enough to partner with Chicago Public Schools and other school districts here locally and nationally for the better part of 10 years at the labs.
Good morning, everyone. Really excited to be here. Grateful for all of you showing up to listen to what we can share with you about critical issues for our youth, for our city. Bogdana, Chkoumbova, I'm the Chief Education Officer for Chicago Public Schools.
Good morning, everyone. I echo the sentiments of the other panelists. Really grateful to be in a room full of folks who care about such an important issue. I'm Jasmine and Gilstrap Hunter. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Lions Pride Mentoring. We're a peer mentoring organization here in Chicago.
Great. Thank you so much again for being here today. With that, I do want to start our conversation with some level setting and just share a few key facts on chronic absenteeism in Chicago and around the country. So CPS defines a student as chronically absent when they've missed 18 or more school days or 10% or more of days enrolled. So this includes both excused and unexcused absences. The most recent data we have for 2024 is that 40.8% of all CPS students were chronically absent in 2024. Again, that's compared when you look back pre-pandemic in 2019, that was at 24%. Still not where it should be, but that increase has been incredibly dramatic and it remains disproportionate for Black and Latinx students. So the issue is also not unique to Chicago. So I do want to underscore that today. We're obviously here in Chicago. We're talking to Chicago experts. But the nation's really grappling with the same trend. Nationwide, 26% of students were chronically absent in 2023 compared to 15% in 2018. And again, that's national averages. It's not looking at other big districts, et cetera, which are more comparable. But just to give you an idea, Chicago is not alone. And so we'll also try to get into some of the things we're seeing across the country and hopefully if there are things we can share and also what you are all learning from your colleagues across the country. But I want to start with Monica. You know, as mentioned, students are considered chronically absent at the 10% mark. If you could talk to us about that threshold number, why we care about it, but also what do we know about the students who are chronically absent? What characteristics do you see?
Sure. So one thing I just want to say from the outset is that the 10% number is almost like a normative number that over time we have coalesced around, but there's nothing magical about the 10% threshold in and of itself. 10% is 18 school days. And what you actually see is that oftentimes there are warning signs where kids start to disengage and start to come, not come to school for 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days. And when you can literally look at a graph of chronically absent students retrospectively, and you see 5 years ago, they were coming to school over 90% of the time, and then it just starts to dip off. And so I do think that there is something really telling about kids who are chronically absent, because that 10% threshold means you're missing 18 days of school, and that's a lot of school. But there's, in and of itself, it's a federal standard, and a standard that's been adopted, I would say, over the past 10 or 15 years, and it's something that we can coalesce around sort of as measurement. So I just want to sort of say that at the outset. That being said, 18 days is a lot of days, and we know that kids who are chronically absent are much less likely to graduate from high school, much more likely to be involved in the criminal legal system, much more likely to be a victim of gun violence, much more likely not to sort of enroll in college and have post-secondary access, and less likely to have higher income levels. Now, these are correlated with other factors. And so one thing that I also want to emphasize is that just like any other measure, like test scores or attendance rates, GPA, they're not evenly distributed by geography and by individuals. And so we have always had schools where the chronic absenteeism rate was hovering around 40 or 50%. And actually now we're going to get into solutions a little bit later, but one of the things that I would encourage us all to do is to think about what worked in those sort of settings in schools even prior to the pandemic. The other thing that I want to say is when you look at kids who are chronically absent, not everybody is chronically absent for the same reasons. And so largely, we think about kids who can't come because of reasons of illness, safety, sort of logistical barriers in terms of getting to school, and kids who won't come because that they don't really see or understand the value proposition of schooling. And what I think we've seen in this huge jump after the pandemic is an increase in both of those kinds of kids, and I don't know what the exact sort of ratio is. That's some of the work that the Better Chicago survey is doing. But it's something that we really need to think about and need to address, because think about every school-based intervention. It can't be effective if kids are actually not showing up and receiving that intervention. And as of now, our sort of safety net in this country has really been schools, and that has been the syringe by which we sort of serve kids with all kinds of social service interventions. And so it's not just the act of not being there for one particular day, it's also the lack of exposure to all of those sort of services that surround them. And then the last thing I'll say is, Todd Rogers, who is a professor at Harvard, has an organization called Everyday Labs. They've been working on this issue a lot. And he has some interesting information that shows that it's actually not, again, it's not the binary of being chronically absent versus not that is the threshold that we need to hyper-focus on. That's important, but that every missed day matters a little bit for your educational achievement. So missing even just one day, you have a lower sort of average test score. And that relationship holds across the spectrum, across grades. And so we really do need to think about having every kid come to as much school as they possibly can.
Okay, Bogdana, could you talk a little bit from your vantage point, the CPS system, just the scale and scope of this issue, maybe both buckets though, won't come, can't come, or how do you see it in Chicago?
Yeah. Chronic absenteeism and absenteeism in general is going to continue to be one of the major hurdles in Chicago public schools. This is one of the indicators that despite other areas of progress that we have seen, is very stubborn. So our chronic absenteeism rates stayed the same for the past 2 years. While we are seeing some small upticks in improvement, specifically like, for example, the first quarter of this school year, this continues to be a huge problem. And our systems-wide approach is focused on 3 key areas. The very first one is really preventive measures, really thinking about what are the conditions in our schools that need to be present so students can feel that sense of connectedness, well-being, sense of belonging, so they actually would come to work. We see this being one of the really huge indicators. The second piece is really thinking about how do we problem solve at the local level to get to the root causes that individual students experience so they are not coming to school. And building a lot of structures around teams that can look at specific data, can really speak with students, with families, and get to understand what precludes students from coming to school. And then, of course, we are really also focusing on some mitigation strategies for the students who are already chronically absent, what we need to do to support them to earn the credits they need to graduate, how we are shifting some of our approaches to credit earning and supports for students who are already in this category. But one of the things that I want to underscore is, for us, vast majority of the students actually are in the would not come category. And our solution right now is really focused listening to researchers and supporters like EdLab, but we also work very closely with Bob Balfans, which is another expert in the field from Hopkins University. We definitely have a lot of other partnerships with To and Through and so many other folks in the space, really understanding that we do have some conditions or some challenges that were presented or amplified by the pandemic. But we also have some long-standing persisting challenges around student attendance. So we're working on both. One of the very first things that we actually started digging into was even during the pandemic. We didn't wait for the post-pandemic. This was actually something that experts had very accurately predicted. That will be one of the challenges for the school system, specifically for the large urban districts. And really focusing down on some shifts in our instructional practices in school. One of the key components around students wanting to come to work is the presence of positive relationships. And when we talk about these positive relationships, we are looking through the lens of how students experience the conditions in each individual classroom. Is their identity valued and uplifted through their instructional experiences? Do the teachers and the school staff thoughtfully create opportunities for them to build positive relationships with their peers, but also the positive relationships with the adults that need to exist? And a lot of these shifts, we have also adopted a lot of tools that can help us to measure and tell whether or not students are experiencing this sense of belonging and well-being. The one that I want to highlight here is also in partnership with University of Chicago. We're one of the first large urban districts to administer the Cultivate survey, which actually looks at the conditions in the classrooms and provide real-time actionable data to teachers as to how their students are experiencing instruction and the tier one experience in the schools. And then, of course, continuing to elevate other models that have proven successful even within our district through school-based teams that are really evaluating attendance practices and reaching out to students. Also significantly expanding opportunities for socialization and also enrichment experiences. Namely, after school has been one of our big areas of emphasis. Last year we had over 180,000 students in CPS experiencing after-school programming based on their interests. We also localized this approach, give an opportunity for every school to design the type of programs that are most desired by their students and probably responding to a lot of the challenges the students experience. And the other piece, like pre-pandemic, I will say, largely our system was really embracing a lot of incentive programs around attendance. Now we are departing a little bit from that approach, not fully abandoning it, but clearly that's not. So the emphasis is right now on relationship building in our schools, giving students opportunities for enrichment and connections beyond the school day. And last but not least, really looking into the concept that Monica alluded to. It is very prevalent. The sort of the value proposition of traditional schooling and how students and parents see that. I mean, it's not a secret that our district was, in virtual learning setting for a very long time. And students and families, saw the option of actually submitting assignments, getting good grades without showing up to school. And right now, we are struggling still with some of this concept and what that really looks and what that means. And some of challenges during the pandemic, like many of our high school students are working, just really being responsive to their needs to support, their families, but also to be present in school. Obviously, transportation, housing issues, I'm not going to really delve into that, but just one sobering statistic is that our population of students in temporary living situations or homeless students has significantly increased. Right now, we have about 26,000 students who are in that. So that really compounds a lot of additional, challenges. Mental health, obviously, I'm not gonna get into that.
Yeah. Okay, there's so many things I want to come back to, but Jasmine, there's so many different paths to go. But Jasmine, sticking with the student level, if you could talk a little bit more about your work and what you're seeing day to day with young people and what their challenges are.
Absolutely. So our program is very unique in that we train students to be the mentors. And so with that peer mentoring approach, we get a lot of information from our mentors when we have our debrief conversations with them that you might not actually get when you're having that one-on-one adult kind of conversation. But I do want to echo the same things that are showing up in the research in the district at large are also showing up with our students in our program as well. We do have that combination of logistics and motivations that can be barriers to our students. At the high school level, our students are tasked with getting themselves to school. I think most of us are familiar with the high school application process in Chicago, and so students are sometimes leaving their communities, taking multiple buses or multiple modes of transportation to get to school. So I do want to echo that sentiment around the logistics, specifically uplift transportation, as one of the main barriers our students talk about a lot when it comes to getting to school. But I also want to emphasize this motivational piece because that comes up a lot in our work. I also think that this mental health challenges is something that our students also articulate. Specifically related to motivation, we have an internal survey we give 3 times a year. It's our student experience survey. We capture data around the student experience in our program as well as their school community at large. And one of our questions asks our students the level to which they agree with, if I miss school, I feel like I'm missing out. And every single year, that question has the lowest agree rate. Students across the board do not feel as though they're missing out when they miss school. And I think it connects to what we've talked about previously around students not understanding the connections between the work they're doing at school and real life skills and that motivation and engagement. So really want to uplift that because I think that is what we see a lot in our work is students not making the connections between what they're learning in school and if they miss out on those opportunities, what that could actually mean for their long-term success.
Really interesting because we've done surveys now 2 years in a row of young people in Chicago. This last summer was 400 youth, ages 10 to 24, representative of Chicago. Mental health came back as the most critical issue they're grappling with, but also their reliance on community-based agencies, not necessarily school resources, but peers, other adults in the nonprofit sector, parents, family. It was really telling that where should we be reaching young people and what are they thinking about, which also is interesting. Bogdana, I want to come back to you. Another chronically absent population is actually the teachers of Chicago Public Schools. And so thinking about our survey data, what you've just said, it is interesting. Could you tell us a little bit more about what that issue is? And then I promise we'll move to solutions. But I want to understand this challenge as well.
This is a really important one, specifically in light of some of our approaches to how we mitigate chronic absenteeism. If you remember, we talked about the importance of relationships. And students feeling that there is a trusted adult in the building that they can connect and they feel supported by. And this is actually one of the indicators that Everyone Graduates project, led by Dr. Belfons, is indicating as this is actually evidence of students feeling connected to their school building. So the state report card that was recently released for our district notes the same percentage of students and teachers being absent. And
So
this
40%
indicates
of CPS
40%.
teachers are also chronically absent.
So This indicates to us, a couple of problems. First of all, this is an evidence that the adults also in our system still have not overcome a lot of the challenges that they have experienced during the pandemic. They also are, mothers, caregivers, so they are facing some, similar situations and issues that they need to address within their, own family. At the same time, where we are seeing chronic absenteeism most evident is actually in our high-need schools and communities. And these are also the schools where we have challenges with staffing, with teacher turnover, and this actually exacerbates the problem around chronic absenteeism. Right before the pandemic, University of Illinois, UIC, actually released another research that was actually focused on what they label to be high churn schools. So these are schools where there is a high mobility of students, high mobility of teachers. And what they found is that there is a very clear correlation between these two factors and student early literacy attainment. And we know the importance of early literacy attainment, right? Students reading on grade level. So we are concerned about this fact. We're really thinking about what CPS needs to do to continue to support the educators, as they are the most, adults most close to our students. And clearly there is a lot of evidence that them being there and supporting our students can help us overcome, some of these issues. We definitely have been leveraging a lot of mentoring approaches, professional learning and support for, our teaching workforce. One of our specific strategies is around distributive leadership, engaging teachers not just as a classroom practitioners, but actually people who participate in this problem-solving process I talked about earlier. They need to be at the table looking into what are the barriers for student attendance, how we overcome them, and what are some of the local solutions. So there's a lot on that topic, but it is a statistic that definitely raises concern for us and tells us that while we continue to work on student, chronic absenteeism, we need to also work on supporting our educators to be there so students can see them.
So Monica, what are some of the evidence-based solutions you've seen to start to tackle this issue?
One thing that I wanted to note is you've mentioned Bob Balfons, who really I think of as the sort of OG of the person who was really focused on dropout prevention and has been talking about this for decades. But I actually recently came across a report that he put out with the federal government and the Institute for Education Sciences in 2011 or 2012. And in that report, they were talking about chronic absenteeism rates of 10%, about how we actually don't know a lot because this wasn't something that was measured. And there were only a few states, Georgia, Maryland, Rhode Island being some of them that were tracking this measure over time. And so it's kind of telling to me how far we've come both in sort of paying attention to this. Obviously, the pandemic exacerbated this, regardless of what your measurement is. But it is really, I think, telling that this is, not a new problem in many ways, and also, very much a challenge that is indicative of like the times that we're living in this sort of post-pandemic space. All hope is not lost. So I would say there are maybe 3 categories of solutions that I think about. One is the just infrastructure of monitoring, data transparency, and reporting. So things like early warning systems, we're going to talk about Rhode Island in a bit, but Rhode Island is one of the states where they built out a public-facing dashboard that everybody was looking at, from the governor down to students and families, and it tracked chronic absenteeism for kids as well as teachers, and all of this was publicly available information. And so a lot of the solutions are in the vein of figure out where this is happening, use a data-driven approach to then understand why, and then develop solutions. That is just kind of how we should operate in education. So that's not new and novel, but I think in particular, we have a lot of data now around absenteeism and chronic absenteeism. It's one of the things that's easy to measure, like, are you here, are you not? And so we really can't, it's easier to coalesce around that than some of the other things that you might equivocate on the measurement. The second category of interventions is what I would think of as like push interventions, and so things like outdated truancy laws, where there is a stick and a consequence for not coming. I think oftentimes we sort of shy away from this approach, but there are sort of small accountability ways in which you can incentivize kids to come. So you can't participate in your after school or extracurricular if you don't come to school. And there is evidence that some of those rules and the enforcement of them have become really lax after the pandemic. All of our habits have changed. And so I think those kinds of push policies are also like a way to hold kids accountable. And then there is what I think of as the pull. And in this category, there's sort of like two kinds of interventions. So one is very sort of light touch things that are easily scalable and not very expensive, like parent communications, family communications. So things like text messages, sending letters home, helps to bridge the gap between parents' belief of like, oh, it's just a couple of days, and what the consequences of that actually might be for their student. And so a lot of what, again, Todd Rogers in the Everyday Lab, but there have been other studies as well. We partnered with Chicago Public Schools in the summer of 2020 to do this for the summer learning program, where we had some of the FACE employees, the sort of community engagement employees, call parents and say, hey, have you registered for summer school yet? And we saw effects that when you call parents and tell them what they should do in a sort of more personalized way, parents will sign their kid up. And then we did text messages to say, hey, don't forget to log on. Because like the difference between 8 and 8:30 when you're in this Zoom world, you literally could forget. So don't forget to log on, school is starting right now. That seems to matter. And then once you're actually there, making sure you've got some personalized and differentiated supports. And I think those solutions can get us, if you believe Todd Rogers' work, like 11 to 15% of the way there. And so the combination of like monitoring, tracking, sending out information home, what I think of again as light touch scalable interventions can get us a significant way there. So we shouldn't leave those on the table. And you just heard Bogdana and Jasmine talk a lot about the importance of relationship building. And so I think about this as a portfolio of approaches. And that can, that's like an 11 to 15% solution. We have a 40% problem. Mm-hmm. What's going to get us the rest of the way there? And that's where some of these more intensive interventions come into play, like, mentoring organizations, even cognitive behavioral interventions like Choose to Change. We see an increase in school engagement. And so some of those relationship buildings, we're also working on skills of like how to get to school and how to prioritize and why it matters, seems to get you, 10 to 20% of the way there as well. So I would say a portfolio approach is probably the most useful across those three categories.
Yeah. So a quick note on just the data and what's happening in Rhode Island. So A Better Chicago also launched earlier this year the Youth Opportunity Dashboard, which we are going to be adding in the chronic absenteeism in the next version. So we'll be able to see that by community, the 77 communities of Chicago. We're also rolling out a new version that will be able to be sorted by the elected school board districts, which is new. So there will at least be a public data source now. What we all do with that is a different question, but at least the data will be out there and hopefully easily accessible for folks. But I know you mentioned partnerships with the districts, sort of both push and pull, but I wanted to bring Jasmine back into that issue of belonging. If you could talk about, that's hard to do at a systems level at scale, right? And so if you could talk about your mentoring program and what you all are doing, some of the skills developed there around that issue of belonging to get young people to want to be in that classroom.
Absolutely. So our student mentors go through a very rigorous training, and at the core of that training is how do you ask really powerful questions? I think asking questions gives you a lot of data. We focus a lot on the numbers and the quantitative data, but the qualitative data is equally as valuable because it gives you more of that insight into what the student is experiencing. And so I want to just uplift the importance of question asking as a huge part of our training process. And then I also am going to go walk through, so give you some tangible resources on our mentorship process that we train our student mentors on. And so when they're meeting with their mentee one-on-one, we have a very specific process that we walk our students through. The first thing that they do when they see their mentee is they ask them a personal check-in question. And so it's really grounding in, I care about you as a whole person, not just you as a student, because I think being seen as a whole individual and not just as an academic student in that setting is incredibly important for our students because they can connect to each other one-on-one at that more personal teenage level. And so that's really important to start building those relationships. The second part of that is looking at data, but that data, again, is not just restricted to numbers. So they are looking at their grades, they are looking at their GPA, but then they're also talking about what's the experience in those classes that might be contributing to those grades or the GPA. And then we actually have our mentee do some personal reflection. So the mentor is explicitly asking their mentee, how do you feel about these numbers? Because I think sometimes we have our own perceptions around what these numbers mean, but that 2.0 GPA might actually be something that that student is proud of, but we with our blinders on because we're super hyper-focused on maybe the 3.0 goal, that we're not fully understanding how proud that student is to have achieved that 2.0. We want to make sure that they feel honored again and feel seen in that space. And then after they have the mentee reflect, that's when our mentors finally step in and give advice and share resources. And so I think really pushing the first part of those conversations on, I want to see you, I want to understand where your perspective is, where you're coming from before I come in and I step in with my mindset is really important for our young people to feel like their voice and their perspective is important at the mentee level. Because our mentors definitely feel that power through the training, but we also want to make sure that their mentees are feeling empowered in that space as well. So that's our check-in process. It really helps our students to build very strong relationships. And we also encourage our students to, if you just spend the entire time just in that first step, just really trying to dig into the personal challenges that your mentee is dealing with, that's okay. I think sometimes we come in with these agendas, especially when we're engaging with young people, and sometimes they tell us, hey, I'm not in the mindset, I don't have the mental capacity, or my mental health is not there for me to actually engage in this work, and we need to pause and listen and be okay with maybe not fulfilling the agendas that we set for these conversations.
Bogdana, where are you seeing some successes and bright spots in the Chicago Public Schools around this issue? Any programs, interventions that you're, feeling is it get us on the right track?
Well, we do. I actually want to touch on one area that I feel like we have not talked enough, and I think it's also very important to paint the full picture of some of these things, and this is actually the connection between student overall performance, academic performance in school, their level of confidence, and really feeling engaged in our schools, and what that means, because there is a strong correlation between this confidence and also their competency, like where the students are currently performing. So just getting them in schools is not enough, but making sure that they have access to supports so they can continue to grow and access the instruction in their classroom, feel like they're strong contributors, and also earn whether or not it's a 2.0 or 3.0 GPA, whatever their current level of progress is. So some of the things that we are really excited, and we are seeing some promising outcomes that are connected to both academic growth and progress, but also student attendance, is our high dosage tutoring program. I think this is a strategy, and it is a program and approach that helps both, right? Helps academic progress, but also in many cases, it's also relationship and sort of a connectedness, approach for, our students. Our Office of Early Childhood has been really focused on parent engagement, and this is also really, really critical. So we are seeing some really positive signs, not only in terms of increasing enrollment in our preschool programs, but kids showing, better attendance earlier in the school year. So parent engagement is important for everyone, but we figured out that this is a very strategic investment, starting with our young families who are bringing their kids for the first time into the system. So that's one. The other approaches that are really paying off for us is this local approach around problem solving and digging into this. We have partnered, throughout the pandemic and even pre-pandemic with Luris Children's Hospital, and one of the really big recommendations was that every school should have a behavioral health team. And schools call them different things, MTSS team, behavioral health team, or anything else. But actually, this is a team of practitioners in the school, including counselors, teachers, support personnel, who meet regularly, look at this actionable data that Monica was talking about very frequently, and really understand what the issues are, design strategies, and implement them at the school level. So we have been investing heavily in strengthening those teams and also equipping them with data. So this is something that is really helpful, and we believe we need to continue to leverage and support this investment. And the other one is the after-school engagement opportunities. And we as a district can do a lot. We have been investing a lot in this, but also we can bring in folks from outside, like organizations here that can bring mentoring programs. Like we see a lot of positive outcomes and improvements with still the programs that we have been using for a while, Becoming a Man, Choose for Change for our, hyper chronically absent students. So all of these partnerships and enrichment opportunities for kids make a huge difference. And the last one that I want to mention is work-based learning opportunities. Our high school students are very engaged when they can see what career pathways are available to them, what that could look like. They're interested to develop relationships with adults in the workspace and get this sort of a coaching and mentoring. So expanding these opportunities have proven for us to be very successful, but it's not at the scale that we would like to see it, but this is actually one of the areas for us.
Can I just say something on that? So one big puzzle that we see, there's this nationally representative survey called the High School Longitudinal Survey. And they do a panel survey around a lot of things for high school students. They've been doing it for a couple of decades. And you can actually see that aspirations for kids in terms of their level of educational attainment have always been high. Like everybody says that they're going to graduate from high school, they all want to go to college. For the first time, actually, we've seen that decline a little bit in terms of going to college in the past couple of surveys, which is unusual. But then when you look, so that's like sort of one data set. Then when you look at the actual returns to schooling, you see this huge widening where the returns from in terms of earnings for college degrees, post-college degrees, high school degrees are only going up. And not having high school degree or just a high school degree, your earnings are going to be much lower, and it's sort of contributing to the widening disparities we see with respect to wealth inequality. And so when we talk and think about the value proposition of schooling for young people, there's a disconnect between what their future life is going to look like based on what we see in the data if they don't get this credential and this degree, and what people are saying that they want to do, and then what they are actually doing. Because you see kids say, I want to go to school, I want to get that. There's an incentive, an economic incentive, and then something's happening in between that is a clear disconnect. And I think, if I'm being honest, even though we have some solutions, all hope is not lost, I think I don't really quite understand that puzzle. But the work-based learning piece feels like a huge point of connectivity that is an opportunity just waiting to be put together. And I think those sectors of business, education, philanthropy, and the sort of civic sector, people try to put them together. It's hard. I'm not sure the incentives are always aligned, but I think that's going to be a really key piece moving forward because of this sort of disconnect in the middle.
And the survey reference that we did this summer, we saw young people turning to community-based organizations more than schools for work-based learning, communication skills, other things. I mean, they were very complimentary of schools for straight academic, math, literacy, foreign language. But then when you looked at these other skills that actually, I think bringing them into the school building, I think would help. We also saw that despite all of these challenges and their articulation, we also saw the real positive, optimistic. So 95% of the young people surveyed said they were incredibly optimistic about their future and had planned to go to college. So it was this same, trying to unpack what is going on here? Like, how do we put this together? So we're going to turn to the audience soon, but just reflecting on all of this and that sort of black box that you're referencing, have we just missed the opportunity to really rethink teaching and learning and schooling? I feel like, coming out of the pandemic, I wrote an op-ed, 1 million people wrote things about this is the moment to finally disrupt education, think about personalized learning and differentiation, And did we blow it? Did we miss this? Is it now? Is this data now the time and the call to action to really think about? Do we really just need to rethink the value proposition, as you said earlier?
Do you want to start with me?
Sure.
Yes, I think there is a disconnect, clearly, even some of the data points that you're pointing out. And I think the disconnect is between our view and perception or understanding of what student success looks like and their own understanding of what student success looks like. So I think we need to think about how we define this. What are some of these indicators of student learning, but also student well-being that we need to be paying attention and support, students? I think that there definitely are a lot of policies and structures that we continue to maintain in our educational system that are not necessarily responsive to the needs of the young people today. Just to name few, like the way how we respond to discipline and behavior problems, the way how we structure graduation requirements, one size fits all. Students want to have more flexibility within that so they can choose pathways, they can double down in certain areas, they can have more work-based opportunities. The flexibility of hours, kids being able to work, to go to community-based organizations or businesses, to have some classes. So the whole concept around community-based, education is really, really critical. I also have to say that we need to be super critical and reflect on the relevance and the responsiveness of the curriculum and what we teach in our schools and in our classrooms. So there is a lot to be unpacked there. I think that it's not too late. I don't necessarily blame the system of doubling down on figuring out supports, as it was really traumatic for many of our kids coming back, for the adults as well. But I think we should never kind of lose focus on the opportunity to continue to innovate and to get out of some of the molds that clearly are not working for our young people. So I definitely would love to see more of this. We had some promising pilots and evidence, like we expanded middle school algebra to unprecedented levels through virtual learning. And actually, we do have not only more kids participating, but actually more kids earning the credit. So there is a lot that our systems can do if they free themselves from the pathways that we have traveled for decades.
Jasmine, do you want to add something? You're like
No,
vigorously
I'm
nodding.
just, echoing, agreeing with everything that was just stated. And I really want to make sure that we are, sorry, I just lost my train of thought, and it's very embarrassing that just happened.
Oh, good.
Gosh, I really had a really beautiful, wonderful point, and I can't believe I just lost it. But actually, that vulnerability I think is incredibly important. Oh yes, it's about modeling vulnerability in this moment, which I think is my point, that I think we have to make the implicit explicit. And I want to go back to, again, this point around the disconnect between the skills that students are learning in the classroom and the real world lived experiences. Because I think that there's wonderful work that is being done in curriculum, and I don't think our young people are fully making the connections between how those skills translate to the real world. So I was a math teacher. I'm not going to use the math example because I know a lot of folks have math trauma, but I will use the ELA example for the point I want to make, which is that research papers are something that I think every student has to do. But if you're not planning on being an academic, most young people are like, this is not useful for my life. When in actuality, I believe that written communication is an essential skill for all of us. Right? We always communicate via like email, text messages, even in the workplace, we send memos, we do reports. Written communication is going to be essential to most careers that our young people are going to pursue, and they're not seeing this opportunity to practice that with this research paper as a life skill. And so I think really being explicit with students around this skill, yes, this is an English paper, you're analyzing this book that we just read, and you are practicing written communication, which is an essential career skill. So I think sometimes we really do just have to name what we're doing and why, because sometimes our young people are not making that connection and we assume that they are. So we really have to make sure we're being explicit with how are we making those connections to, yes, you're doing this in this academic setting, and once you graduate, pursue careers, you will also be utilizing this skill just in a different capacity.
Excellent, thank you. So audience questions rolling in. So some are very specific, some go larger, but I'll start with a few specifics. Is there data that shows the absentee numbers between CPS selective enrollment schools versus neighborhood schools? And is there a large difference between the types of schools?
Oh, wow.
I'm happy to.
I will kind of lean into what Monica said. I mean, if there is a very clear pattern, then that's going to lead to a very clear solution. But the absenteeism rates are kind of evident, in different pockets for different students and for different reasons. If we know that just, selective enrollment schools and their, level of, rigor within their classrooms is the solution, we're definitely going to be looking into that. But there are many different. I will say that one of the most persistent areas actually is high need schools in communities where we see indicators of poverty, violence, high mobility rates. This is definitely the places where we see higher absenteeism.
And the higher mobility rate, we've seen that too when we looked across the country, and Tulsa was one, but they went after the chronic absenteeism issue around some different housing policies and embedding supports in the schools to help families navigate housing issues. And it was just interesting, a different policy area to come at the truancy issue. So similarly, rates of chronic absenteeism, are they consistent across grades? Or in early grades, are they different than upper grades? And then how does one respond in that and help support parents, particularly in the early grades, get young people to school?
Yeah, so we actually, the pattern of increases are the same in magnitude. Earlier grades tend to have better attendance than later grades. I think the geographic variability and the sort of school by school variability is greater than the grade by grade variability, if that makes sense, which is to say that the patterns, like young kids are coming to school, but we do have a lot of young kids who are chronically absent, and the same is true for older grades. The interventions are going to be different. So a few years ago, probably 10 years ago now, we partnered with Chicago Public Schools on this intervention called Check and Connect. And it was just a system, again, of data monitoring and then having the teacher check in with the parents, et cetera. We saw large and significant increases for young kids, but then that tended to fade out when you got to older kids because you had a little bit more agency. And so, the opposite was true. We saw effects on older kids, but not younger kids because it wasn't a parent-based intervention. And so I think the parent-based intervention is something that we really need to be thinking about for younger kids versus older kids. But young kids come to school a little bit more, but the patterns are the same in terms of increases after the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you talked a bit about the parent engagement.
Yeah, actually it looks like a very typical bell curve.
Yeah.
So chronic absenteeism and absenteeism in general is very high in early grades, very early, preschool. That's why we're attacking preschool. Then continuously improves over time until it gets overall peak in the middle grade, 7th, 8th grade. And then it starts a decline in high school. So where we see the most persisting challenges are very early on, and then high school, namely.
A question around the most impactful way that teachers can lead peers on improving attendance. And how do we balance hard learnings from the pandemic, like the 5 mental health days, the staying home when sick, like trying to allow that flexibility with also the importance of consistently coming to school?
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I think definitely with our peer approach, that peer accountability, students definitely relate to each other very differently than they do adults. So adult and a young person can say the exact same thing, and the young person's mindset and that language is gonna just connect with that young person more. So I think with our program specifically, having peers be mentors to their peers is something that allows them to have a different level of accountability because, hey, I also took multiple buses to get here too, and I'm still here. And so that's a different language and a different conversation that a young person can have with another young person than an adult can have with a young person. So I do think the peer approach is really important for students to all feel like we missed you, we care that you are here. And I think creating that classroom culture, back to your point, is really essential. If your students care about each other, if they work together, they see themselves as part of a community, then the community is going to miss you when you're not there. And so it is important that yes, we have mentorship opportunities for our young people to support each other, and really emphasizing that importance of the classroom culture, which is dictated by teachers' presence and teachers consistently being there. So I think that the intersection of the teacher absenteeism kind of is impacting the student absenteeism from that perspective of those communities are not being built in classrooms if the teacher can't be physically present to help create that culture in their classroom.
And there was another question on the fidelity of sort of being able to do that work sort of system-wide, implement it school by school, and how do you think about that? Maybe Bogdana.
I mean, that's why we are really taking an approach that is very local at the individual school levels. Our schools, depending on the model schools and the communities where they're situated, they're experiencing variation, in the challenges and how they work together, but also elevating some really strong practices across schools and sharing these opportunities and what different teams are doing. Right now, we are really also investing a lot in just training these teacher teams, as I mentioned earlier, how to look into the data, what are some of the problem-solving strategies and protocols. We are encouraging folks to do things like, for example, empathy interviews, like really listening to students. Let's hear that. And not all teachers know this. I mean, we went to teacher school without probably being taught how to do some of those things, but how to engage in that process, how to build an internal system and have roles and responsibilities for every adult in the building in that sort of support system. We have invested in expanding a lot of the counselor supports around our school, so we needed to also support them to really see what is the type of role that they can play as a leader in the building to organize and share strategies with the rest of the staff, because 1, 2, or 3 counselors probably is not going to be enough to address a lot of those challenges. And the other one is really helping schools to implement these structures with, fidelity and frequency, because attendance is such a dynamic data indicator. If you're not, looking at it, I would say probably on a weekly basis, very quickly you're going to miss the opportunity to prevent, something from happening. So a lot of that. And it is kind of a little bit more distant, but a lot was said about data and sharing data and all this type of things. I just want to elevate for everyone. In Chicago Public Schools, we see this as one of the huge problems, and this is one of our district-wide goals that is central to our new strategic plan that we have released that is addressing chronic absenteeism and really identifying and selecting a lot of indicators around this student connectedness and well-being and what that looks like. This will be a system that will continue to provide more data and information for not only school staff, but for the public. The data transparency piece is really important for us. So we're starting with, hopefully towards mid to late December to start publishing web pages for each of our schools and a lot of data points that can help everyone to really understand what that looks like.
A question which we haven't looped back to is around the 40% teacher absenteeism. And, are there specific solutions around that? We've talked a lot about the data around students, but is there anything you can comment on as potential solutions, whether here or elsewhere that we're seeing in the nation?
So outside of really supporting overall, teacher well-being, we are really targeting the schools, and I mentioned that earlier, that are chronically, understaffed, or there's a lot of teacher turnover. In places where this happens, the culture and actually the experiences that the educators have in these buildings is not positive. They go, stay for a short period of time, and then transition. And students rely on adults that they can see year after year. So we are definitely working through a lot of programs around, our pipelines, to really get us educators who are committed to serve certain communities and students. We have explicit effort on hiring and retaining and promoting teachers of color because this is vast majority of our students. There is a lot of, evidence and connection, how students respond to this. Really thinking about what are some other strategies and incentives we can bring in, into schools around mentoring. Like this is one of the years where we, as a district, supported over 2,000 mentors, and that was actually like incentivized, paid, opportunity for our teachers, and bringing a lot of partners who work with teacher teams in schools. Like I know some of the organizations here that I see, our colleagues and friends that are engaged to help teachers on the ground during their team meetings, thinking about these strategies and what that could look like.
Go ahead.
Oh, go
We have a minute. I was going to say that we have a number of, to your point, nonprofits, philanthropy, other civic leaders in this audience. So, how else can they help? How can we engage on this issue? It's obviously a citywide issue that we all need to lean into.
Well, I was just going to hold up the example again of Rhode Island, which I think is nationally a model of what to do. But there, I think there were a couple of things that happened. One is a clear articulation of what the goal is. So they also had this issue of a 40% chronic absenteeism rate among teachers and educators as well as students. And school systems have lots of goals that they are trying to accomplish at the same time. But there was sort of vertical alignment across the governor and the state superintendent and other leaders that this was going to be the thing that they worked on. And so this public dashboard became a tool, but everybody was sort of monitoring, and like literally the governor would be calling principals in schools. So there was sort of, I know accountability is like a bad word, but there's social accountability. The data made the social accountability possible. And then the problem solving happened at the local levels, but there was sort of this public social accountability. And I think the combination of those two with the really strong leadership articulation of the goal seems to have been the secret sauce in Rhode Island, and they have reduced their teacher chronic absenteeism rate. Excellent. I don't know whether you want the governor calling teachers.
That's good news. Any last comments? I know we're close to time.
About the last question.
Yeah. The folks in this room, everyone wants to be helpful. How can they support, engage, learn more?
Yeah, I think we talk about this a lot in the nonprofit sector and the philanthropy sector too, around time, talent, and treasure. And I think we are in a space, it's the giving season, to really take stock of what are the resources that you have. What do you have to give time-wise? What do you have to give maybe financially? What do you have to give talent-wise? I think to the point earlier about those workforce connections really matter for our young people. Volunteerism is incredibly important for our young people to be exposed to different career opportunities. You can't be what you can't see. And so I really encourage folks to really take stock of what do you have the capacity to give additionally, because I think whatever you have to give, I'll speak for myself, my organization, we are more than welcome to take on. So really just be self-reflective of what do you have the capacity for and how can you help support this work and move this work forward.
I will also say, continue to support us in the initiatives that many of you are involved. And they range, like we have here, in this room, but just in general. Supporters who are helping us to build our infrastructure around the implementation of the continuous improvement and data transparency policy. Help us to elevate this social awareness and accountability by really engaging the broader community in seeing the facts and the data that exist. So that's like really critical. Continue to support us to implement these proven strategies around high dosage tutoring, work-based learning, enrichment opportunities, community schools. Like these are all really important opportunities for our students. But at the same time, I will say, I personally always welcome the pressure towards innovation. Yeah. Like what are some things that we do not see and that you also can help us to implement citywide? Because it may seem like a school-based problem. This is a attendance problem, right? But I think this is a huge problem for everyone, for employers, for nonprofit organizations, for everyone. Our students need to be engaged, need to be prepared. They need to be on an upward economic mobility trend so they can have the jobs that will help them to sustain families, and they can be contributing members of that society. And it starts with showing up and learning.
Well, thank you so much for that ending. There's obviously so much more to learn on this topic. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you for all the questions. There were many more that I was not able to get to. But a huge round of applause for our panelists. And thank you again to University of Chicago Ed Labs to be our partner in this work and in this event, and just have a wonderful day. Thanks again for being here.